We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker, your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Laura Dresser, who's a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And more importantly for our purposes, she's the Associate Director of the High Road Strategy Center, which I like to point out used to be known as the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, which had the fantastic acronym COWS. But anyhow, I should also mention Laura and I are old friends from graduate student days at the University of Michigan, I guess close to 40 years ago now. Anyhow, Laura, welcome to Mostly Economics.
Thanks for having me, Dee. Good to see you.
So let me start. The main thing I want to get at, you've been working at the High Road Strategy Center and the earlier incarnation as COWS. And one of the main points you and your co-conspirator here, Joel Rogers, always make is that, there are people like me. I'm not in Washington anymore, but I did spend a lot of time in Washington. We always think, everything that we might want to do about the world is in Washington, that we have to get through Congress, get the president. And the point that you and Joel make is that that's as much as we might like to see things done, and there are often good things done in Washington. There's an awful lot at the state and local level. And particularly now when I don't think many people are anticipating much good coming out of Washington anytime soon. So you focused on issues that can be dealt with at the state and local level. And obviously that's a lot of things that affect people's lives. So let me just throw it out to you. What are the big things that you've worked on in your time, your decades now at the High Road Institute and its predecessor? What are the big things you've worked on? What have you tried to accomplish? What have you actually accomplished?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to kind of land on that. Obviously your point, Dean, that the federal context is actually right now so brutal. And it's so riveting. Like, it is hard to look away from the destruction and horror that is DC policy mayhem. Thank you. You have good words for that. And it right now, but like you said, I've been at the High Road Strategy Center, formerly COWS, and I felt like I could always gauge exactly how far I was from Wisconsin by whether people thought that was funny or just unfortunate. But anyway, so we changed our name to High Road Strategy Center to make more sense to the people who were further away. But I think the people of Wisconsin missed their joke. But anyway, we've always focused on what you can do and build at the state and local level. This means, like state policies, also what cities can do, especially a lot of work with mayors, but additionally what you can do inside private relationships, inside firms, or inside partnerships, inside industries. There's a lot of things moving in the economy that are not just the Fed nightmare, the data at BLS nightmare, the destruction, the anti-worker and anti-immigrant hostility. There's still all sorts of things that are going on in our economy and in working people, that directly impact working people's lives at the state, local, and even industry level. And I've worked a lot on all of those for 3 decades now, and I don't know how we got this old, but so I guess those are the locations we've looked for leverage. And, and it's also, I feel like it's important, especially now, to see that people's lives are determined, the quality of people's lives. Yes, these federal things matter a lot, but state government's running your Medicaid and a lot of the terms of the health insurance. They're running your education, your higher education system, the cost of higher education. They're influencing directly your transportation and the infrastructure, whether that's the technical infrastructure or the human capital infrastructure or the physical infrastructure of your state, that's getting managed at the state level usually, and then sometimes at lower levels. And so engaging in the question of local governance is really putting people's living standards, right, at the center and actually trying to make a difference, even when there's a lot of crap coming down from DC.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's one of these things. I still identify as a Washington person, even though I've been out of Washington, I guess, for about 7 years now. But it is easy to say. Even when you get, you made the point about Medicaid, so it's a lot of that's determined at the federal level, but how that's managed at the state level makes a huge difference. As we've seen, and right now you have the Trump administration trying to rein in what the states are able to do, but many states have gone much further. I mean, just most obviously expanding Medicaid so that. You have many states where far more people are covered. They have higher income cutoffs so that it's not just, very low income people, moderate income people are covered as well. And that makes a big difference. And then you have issues, what is covered, what sort of procedures are covered, is abortion covered, that's, so you have issues like that do make a huge difference. So even when you have a federal program, I mean, Medicaid's designed as a federal state program, but how it's actually implemented does, states have a lot of say in it.
Yeah, it makes an enormous difference. Prepartum and postpartum coverage for low age or for low income women. These things, have an enormous impact on health. We're in Wisconsin. And I think when Joel came here originally aspiring to kind of show what was possible, Wisconsin was more, you could see more of the progressive tradition in Wisconsin. But of course, what we've seen a lot is a kind of different question of state policy. And if anybody wants to talk to me about the power of state policy, I look at the labor movement. And when I came to Wisconsin, it was I came here in 1995, and up until 2010, the share of the labor force that was unionized in Wisconsin was higher than the national average. So way higher because we had a lot of manufacturing, and then we lost a lot of that manufacturing. So the gap shifted. But by 2011, still higher than the national rate of unionization, 14% for the state, 13% for the Fed at the federal level. And then at the state level, we passed Act 10, which made the terms of public sector unionization it's basically deunionized. It's not completely and thoroughly, but really hard to retain unions in the public sector. And a few years later, we passed so-called right to work legislation. The share of the workforce in the state of Wisconsin that's unionized now is 7%, half what it was in 2011. That state policy about unions. I know we all, the PRO Act and whatever, and going in DC, what's happening at the NLRB, all that stuff matters a lot, but there's actually very concrete state policy that those sets worked in the wrong direction in this state, but really to enormous impact and relative to the national trend, which went from 13 to 11 over that period, or to regional neighbors.
Let me ask, I just want to go into a little bit because I think a lot of people don't know, and I have to say I'm not totally up to date on the specifics of Wisconsin, but I believe that you no longer allow payroll deduction for public sector employees. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's one of the four brutal aspects of what was called Act 10, the anti-public sector unionization legislation. No employer withdrawal. Unions couldn't negotiate for more than a cost of living increase, and couldn't negotiate over nothing but wages. So no benefits, no working conditions. These were supposed to be off the table. And then the only thing on the table that was wages, and the best you could do was the cost of living. The other aspect was that you had to recertify. You have to recertify annually. You have to run an election and win more than half the votes of the unit, not of the voters, but of the unit, to maintain representation.
Yeah, that's pretty hard. And also,
it's brutal.
The point about payroll deduction, if people are not familiar with it, most workplaces where you have a union that's been recognized, the employer, usually it's a condition of the contract that you pay your union dues, whatever it is, $5, $10, whatever it is a month. It comes out of your paycheck. So the union doesn't have to go after its members and say, hey, you didn't pay us the $5 last month or 10, it's directly out of your paycheck, which obviously makes it much easier for the union to function. And I guess Wisconsin has now prohibited that. So again, it's another very big obstacle.
So it's mostly the teachers unions that have managed, the teachers unions in the cities have managed to hold on to representation, but they have to do a hustle to get people to sign up to pay dues and to run these elections all the time
I
and
want
to
to
show up
also
and vote.
just say a little bit, because it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, the so-called, you call it so-called, so I'm not going to get down on you for it, but so-called right to work, because I always thought this was, I mean, from the standpoint of the people who are anti-union, it's a brilliant term,
It is
but
brilliant
to my
marketing.
view, it kind of turns reality on its head. So specifically what we're talking about here is if you have workers that organize, they've organized a unit and they negotiate a contract. And the question is, can they say, okay, everyone who benefits from this contract has to pay to support the union? They don't have to join the union. Maybe you hate the union, whatever. You think they're all jerks or, whatever. You don't have to join the union, but you're benefiting from their representation. If your boss gets pissed at you and wants to fire you, the union's obligated to represent you. You might hate them. They might hate you. They're legally obligated to represent you. So what that means, the idea here is that the union could sign a contract that says, okay, everyone who's benefiting from this contract has to pay their share of the fee, $10, $20, whatever it is, they have to pay it, whether they like the union or not. And what right to work does, it says, no, you can't sign a contract like that. So the employer gets to put whatever conditions they want on employment. They could say, you have to wear a stupid hat. You have to, everyone who comes in, you have to go, hello, Mr. or Ms. So-and-so, how are your kids? If you don't do that, you get fired. And, the answer is always, well, if you don't like that, go work somewhere else. But suppose your coworkers say, oh, we have a union here and we want you to contribute. They go, no, you can't do that. Right to work. And that just drives me nuts.
It's a horrible name. I mean, at least we know when we're saying Act 10 about public sector union, I mean, it's all code words, though nobody understands what it means. And it's so subtle, right? It's not really, it doesn't take away the right to unionize. It just brutally undermines all the aspects of unionization and the so-called, what people call right to work. In Wisconsin's, one of this, like this, it's a special tragedy here because Wisconsin invented public sector unionization in its kind of form and was a center of private sector unionization and what that legislative strategy that gets called right to work does is it just eviscerates private sector unions. That's what it's meant to do. That's what it's made for. And it gets a name that feels a lot more elevated than that.
So let's go into some other areas. Obviously a lot can be done: transportation, education, housing. I know with education, I live in Oregon now, and community college here is free, which is something that President Biden tried to do nationally. He was blocked in that. It's one of the ironies that you have with Trump, that they're beating up on Harvard and the other Ivies and saying, oh, why don't we spend that money that Harvard's getting? And to be clear, they're getting it in contracts for doing specific research, but whatever. They're saying, why don't we instead give that money for people to go to trade schools? That's actually what Biden wanted. I mean, he didn't necessarily want to take it away from Harvard, but he was trying to do that. So anyhow, as I said, I think it's a great thing that, in Oregon, community college is free. So what sort of things have you all worked on education in Wisconsin?
Yeah, in Wisconsin, and actually I got the luck of working some with the Oregon community colleges just because of some of the labor management partnerships and other training strategies I worked with. Community colleges, and in Wisconsin we have technical colleges, which are really work facing, are sort of one of the, I feel like it's one of this like unspoken and unstudied. It is the center of working class education, right? Like this is the biggest machine that helps working people affordably move into better jobs. And it's always pretty responsive to the local labor market, understanding what the healthcare employers and the manufacturers and whatever need, because these workers are, generally, sometimes they're working adults, sometimes they're 18-year-olds coming out of the school system, but they're likely to stay. And so the information on the local labor market is pretty clear in these places. And the connection for graduates is really good. And so in the state of Wisconsin, for example, if you do some college, but you don't finish the degree, you fart around for a couple of years, not that people do that, rack up a lot of credits, even 3 years worth of credits. The wage impact of that is almost nothing. It's just like going to high school. Getting a 2-year college degree getting an associate's degree and moving into this labor market is going to move you above the state median wage. And without finishing the degree, you're going to be $3 or $4 below the median wage. And that and I think we talk too much. Yeah. Or at a state policy level, the question really is less about Harvard and the private institutions and much more about what are you doing about your post-secondary. Yes, your 4-year system, yes, your flagship, but also what are you doing about your 2-year system and those schools that are accessible to working people, that are much more affordable, and that relate directly to jobs when they get out. So we've done a lot of work with trying to think about how to make sure that connection from the community college to the workplace works better. And how working people can go to school, because school is so often set up for full-time students, for 18-year-olds, for people who have other costs extended. And so these kind of questions of affordability and scheduling and content are really important. So we've done a lot of work around that. It's sort of inside the mechanics of community colleges, but thinking about making those work better for working people is the bottom line. And it's this system that I think people just don't pay enough attention to.
I haven't seen data on it. Obviously, people do compile it, but I imagine there are huge differences in the percentage of, college-age kids. I guess we put that 18 and 25 who are either enrolled in, some form of post-secondary education or completed it. Obviously, if you're going to 25, I gather there's huge differences across states. I've not looked at that data, but I gather.
Yeah, I've looked at it some, not super recently. One of the things that, Wisconsin and I was interested. I assumed it was a manufacturing story, and then I looked at the data, and it was really more like, I don't know, is this a Nordic immigration story? But it was sort of Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota had really high shares of the workforce whose terminal degree was from a community college. Obviously more people end up with 4-year degrees in labor markets, both because they go the route to get the 2-year degree and then they terminal with a 4 or more. But it's a substantial, I think the last time I looked it was about 6% of the adult labor force in the state of Wisconsin. Their terminal is a 2-year associate's degree. And those folks are doing way better than folks who spend time at college but never get a degree.
I have this hard driven home to me because I have 2 blocks from the community college. I could use their gym, and oftentimes I go by there. They have various healthcare programs, and I've been startled more than once because they have, the term's not a mannequin. I don't know what you'd call it, but so it's like
it
a
is
human.
like a mannequin. It's like a simulation body, or there's some good word for it, but I've lost it.
Yeah. Anyhow, I've walked by there and I go, oh my God, they got someone, and then and it happened to me. It's even though I know that, they have the classes there, but yeah, I mean, that's an area where, community colleges could be enormously useful because there's a number of degrees, obviously a doctor, whatever you need to go to med school and advanced training, but there's a lot, physical therapy, there's a whole set of positions in the healthcare sector, which are going to expand. They are expanding. They're going to expand hugely. And we need a lot more because, there's shortages. Hospitals say that they can't get enough. And of course, we're deporting a lot of these people. But,
yes.
But
I think of it as like the technical middle, like the person who comes in. There's a lot of people you think are actually technically nurses who probably aren't. A lot of them are certified medical assistants, and those usually or almost always come through 2-year systems or on the job training systems. And a lot of the people that you do encounter nurses are getting the 2-year associate degree of nursing and then moving into nursing and sometimes moving to bachelor's and master's level from there. But the bulk of nursing, unless you're in a university teaching hospital, those are 2-year degrees. Everybody doing this ultrasound tech and the radiological tech and the phlebotomy and the lab work, like all of that's coming out of the 2-year systems. And really, thinking about how that system works matters for, all of our health in addition to just working people getting decent jobs.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great state level policy because that obviously can be done at the state and obviously also local level to some extent.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about, well, how we want to put it, energy use, transportation. There too, there's huge differences across states, and I saw the numbers a while ago. I don't have them at my fingertips, but California has hugely reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. As a matter of conscious policy, they promoted clean energy, they promoted public transit. That's an area that, again, it matters for the planet, obviously, but it matters for people's lives. I mean, if you could make low cost energy available, which clean energy is now. If you can make public transit available, it's a lot more convenient for a lot of people. I personally hate to drive in traffic. I don't mind driving cross country, but I do hate to drive in traffic. And I think most people feel the same way. I've never met anyone who really liked being in a traffic jam. So that is an area that, the transportation sector, again, it matters at the federal level, what money's forthcoming for different types of projects, but states do have an enormous say on that.
I think it's exactly right. Like these are the things that cost people a lot of money: transportation, energy, higher education, childcare, and all of these, at the state level. It's true that the federal framework matters a lot, like what's going into the highways and what's going into um, the state consideration and what's going into the funds for public transit at the federal level. But then when you get to the state, the questions of what are our design principles, what are our state investments, what are and how much are we attending to the questions of, the access of rich people who want to get into a city, and how much are we attending the access of the working people who need to get around in a city? Like how do we balance all these things? Those are state policy and often even regional, economic development policy. And by just, yes, the federal framework matters, but again, even if the federal framework is a mess, you can have a big difference between the kind of investments that California is doing in public transit and in accessibility and attentive to questions of equity, and the kind of thing that plays a more conservative state, I assume, that is just throwing at the freeways and throwing at developers. How are you balancing democratic interests is what's happening at the state level and in transportation. And again, like you were saying, it makes an enormous difference to commuters' lives, like how much time they're spending in cars, how much they have to pay on their cars, whether they can afford the public transit options, and whether those public transit options are really designed for them. All of that, being sort of central to. I don't do this. I do the labor market stuff more. But folks at the High Road Strategy Center work really hard on transportation and thinking about state frameworks and moving away from this kind of a set of engineering metrics that really focus you on moving cars fast and moving to more synthetic ways of thinking about what is accessibility and transportation and how do you make that work for more people.
Yeah, in terms of the negative on that, I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago wasn't all unique this way. There it was probably, and again, I'm not an expert on what, the politics that went into it. The highway systems were almost designed to promote segregation. So there's a big highway that goes to the south side of the city, and one side of the highway was all black, the other side was all white. And, blacks knew not to go on the white side because it was literally dangerous. I mean, there were. I'm not saying it all unjust. I mean, people who tried to buy homes in those neighborhoods, they were going to be threatened. Their houses were firebombed. So again, the highway was the divider, and obviously it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, right. Or transportation as a tool of the divider, the destruction, the segregation of the city is a kind of deep history. And thinking about, and even a celebrated, like some of this dividing and, that gets celebrated as these important moments in suburbanization, I think, or a model of the American city that made a certain kind of thing possible. But I think really at the cost, with zero attention to especially communities where folks have way less money and really closely related to questions of black-white segregation and just running over or cordoning off Black communities, is all part of the history. And again, that mostly was state policy that was running that. That was local people who figured that out, given a federal framework. But just as you can find these incredibly destructive examples, I think one of the things that the High Road Strategy Center is always trying to do is, right, like when there's room to play, you can find the destructive examples. It also means that there's like something better to do. And if you can get people behind that, the state, unions, businesses, communities demanding it, or government or elected leaders pursuing it, you can change the terms of people's lives at the local level, whatever improve it, whatever the federal framework.
So let me mention something you said in passing, but I know you've obviously done a lot of work on labor issues, childcare, which is obviously a huge issue for parents, young parents, mostly women in that situation, because they tend to get stuck with the childcare if they don't have it provided elsewhere. What have been state local policies on childcare, and how successful have you been in Wisconsin? I guess I'll put it that way.
Well, the success of childcare, mostly with so much policy stuff, the success of with childcare that I've been affiliated with or gotten to learn about is usually a little bit further from the state of Wisconsin. I would say, one thing that's really clear to me and people who spend any time looking at these jobs is that we kind of pretend that, or I think it feels to people as they look at the childcare industry that they're looking at different problems. It's unaffordable. It's too low quality. The jobs suck. But those are all the same problem. It's unaffordable because it's intensive. It's costly to develop little kids. The job suck because we have not invested in it. So like there's a magic wand that hits when you hit 4 or 5, depending on the state. And then all of a sudden you're a public good and you get invested in by the public school system. But up to that point, you're completely private good, right? Like the little kid is like how well their parents do is how well their education or how much quality their education is going to have. And so the affordability issues, the job quality issues, and the care quality issues are really all the same question of a lack of public investment. And, I think in a way, the ideal would be a big federal investment. We got some of that during the COVID response time. And states really did a lot of innovation with, kind of dumping money into the industry in order to support the workers and the parents and the providers so that quality and accessibility could happen in as we came out, or even during, like childcare for essential workers during the pandemic, or the folks who were still having to show up, and childcare workers were those workers. All that money has been going away, but states have learned from those investments. I think Minnesota has stuck with a big investment that goes both to affordability but also to workers' pockets. And that I really pay attention to see if we're trying to change the standard of the job, improve the quality of the job so workers in the childcare industry really can thrive. And, I know Minnesota passed some stuff the last couple of years. The state of Wisconsin is doing some investment. It's more limited than the governor wanted. It's less than the legislature, which is Republican controlled and quite ideological wanted. But it's at least something. But another thing is, just how much the floor under the labor market is, where the floor is, and how well it's enforced really matters to childcare workers. So the states that have moved to raise their minimum wage, again, this is another area of state policy because the feds, the feds just got out of the business of ever attending to the question of the minimum wage, apparently. And the states have really taken it on. And now, what is 29 states have higher? Not sure the right number, but, a lot of states are above the 725. Wisconsin is not. And that policy alone matters a lot to childcare workers.
That's really a striking story that, obviously, well, it's, I think maybe not fully underappreciated might be the wrong term, but I'll just say it really transformed thinking in economics that in the 80s, you had a lot of liberals. I mean, I remember the New York Times had an editorial back about 86. I might have the year wrong, but I know I have the decade right, where it said the optimal minimum wage, 0. And, it gave the argument minimum wage costs jobs. And, there was very good research done first in the early 90s. David Card and Ellen Kruger wrote a real path-breaking paper. And since then, hundreds and hundreds of papers. And, they've shown that one, minimum wage doesn't cost jobs. And the other thing that, I found striking, that there's much more freedom at the state and even local level. So I'd always been of the view that, and I don't think I'm alone, I think a lot of economists thought that, well, maybe the federal government could raise the minimum wage, maybe even a state can, but can a city, can San Francisco raise the minimum wage, can Seattle raise? And again, a lot of research, and it shows that, in I'm going to say in almost all, because there could be an exception. And just to be clear, I'm sure, if we just say $40 a minimum wage, that will cost jobs. I'm absolutely sure of that. But, there's much, much more freedom to raise the minimum wage than, I think most of us, I'm referring to economists, the us here, had recognized. And that makes a huge difference in people's lives, because it's not just, if the minimum wage is, 18 an hour, is I should know where it is now. Seattle, I think, has the highest. Something like 18 might be a little higher. Yeah. Do you know what it is now in Seattle?
Actually, I could look it up right now, but I don't know what it is in Seattle. There's a lot of places it's 15, statewide, Illinois, California. There's a range in Oregon, right? And I think Washington. And, the other one that I think is just there's so much room to move, and that needs to be attended to is the question of the tip minimum, the exception that is made for tipped workers.
Yeah.
So everybody has a minimum wage. And then often there's this like exception category. If you're a tipped worker, the employer the employer owes you the minimum wage, but they only have to pay $2.30 of it, or some smaller amount. In the state of Wisconsin, it's $2.30, and that's federal $2.13. And there are states that have moved the floor on the tip minimum wage, just like the employer owes you the minimum wage, and then you get your tips on top of that. That's true in Minnesota, right? And other states have really just ended that practice and made an enormous difference to tipped workers instantly, just through that one practice. In fact, as attending to, if you really want to, in my view, if you really want to attend to the income of tipped workers, we don't think about the tax policy first. We probably think about the minimum wage policy first. But
yeah.
I'm not in DC, so no one's asking me that.
My colleague at CEPR, Sylvia Allegretto, who I actually had on an earlier segment, she's probably a leading expert on this. And she was pulling her hair out, as you had Trump going out there saying, oh, we're going to make tips tax free. You go, well, that's nice. But, the tax that most, I understand in Las Vegas, you have tipped workers that might get, 20, 30, 40,000 a year in tips, but that's about the only place. Yes. Your typical tipped worker is getting, 5,000 a year in tips. If they have kids, they're paying almost nothing in taxes. They're getting the earned income tax credit. So it's almost worthless, or in many cases, completely worthless to large numbers of tipped workers. So you want to make a difference in their lives, get rid of the tip tax credit, say that the minimum wage applies to them. Of course, it's better to raise the minimum wage, but at least whatever the minimum wage is, they should know they're getting that, and then the tips are on top of that. Which again, just to my view, it's just kind of honest, because I don't, we're economist nerds, so we know about the tipped, the minimum wage, the tip tax credit, but the tip credit. But most people, I imagine, a typical person going in a restaurant, they're thinking that, well, they don't know what the person waiting on gets exactly, but they assume it's the minimum wage. And then when they leave their tip, that's something on top of that. They don't realize, no, they need that to get the minimum wage.
Get to the minimum. Yeah, no. And the mechanics on it, the people who understand the mechanics the best are people who do the work, right? Like, so I teach a lot of students, and they all know the exact mechanics of the tip minimum. But yeah, no, consumers just don't. And actually distinguishing, like, are you a tipped worker? Are you a tipped worker? Like, even that there's some real questions around that. And to just raise that, and to make it honest, to make it transparent, like, this is the minimum wage. It applies to everyone. And then beyond that, we have tips.
Yeah.
So that's, and you can do that at the state level.
Yeah. No, and and again, it has been done. I don't know what the breakdown is, but a number of states have gotten rid of their tip minimum, and that's an ongoing battle in D.C. where the voters had approved a referendum that said they were getting rid of the tip minimum, and now I don't know where exactly it stands. I think the city council, because I know the mayor is pushing for it, I think the city council reversed that, or again, I'm not sure where it stands. And
Well, this is such a good point because I think all of these policies are really popular. Raising the minimum wage happened on the floor to $15 an hour, happened on the Florida ballot that elected Donald Trump in 2024. Raising the minimum wage happens in Missouri if you put that on a ballot. If you put things about labor standards, paid family leave, um, these sorts of policies are incredibly popular with, even in conservative areas. It just makes sense that jobs should pay a decent wage. That is what people want from the economy. And it's always a little shocking that people back off that politics so much because it is such a winning issue when you put it on a ballot. And then you have state after state trying to undermine that power, or, the local governments also where something gets passed. Or state governments, the other dynamic is the state government preempting the ability of the local government to do what its citizens want. That happens a lot, especially in conservative states where cities might pass a higher minimum wage or a paid leave or a no tip to minimum policy, and the Republican legislature just opposes it and shuts down the local ability to do that.
Yeah, that is a big and growing problem. It's probably fair to say that this is long-standing, so we can't just blame Donald Trump for this, that the state ultimately determines what the cities could do. So the cities are, in effect, entities, creations of the state. So if a city, if the state doesn't want cities to have higher minimum wages, doesn't want them to have mandate paid leave, family leave, they could just say cities can't do that. And in a lot of states where you have conservative states, but you have relatively progressive cities within them, the state government has just said, no, you can't do that.
Well, this is almost every conservative state still has pretty progressive cities because cities are just more progressive places. And so Birmingham and Alabama or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or whatever, like all these places have tried to pass things and secure the rights that people democratically choose.
So I've taken up a lot of your time. Let me just ask if there's anything really big out there that we should be talking about that we haven't covered.
Oh my gosh. Well, I do think I appreciate you focusing on state and local stuff. I think one of the things that is true right now, at least from my perspective, is it's really easy to feel like loss is on every horizon and all we're doing is losing. And let me say, as a person from Wisconsin, right? I have worked on labor issues in the state while the state's labor movement has fallen apart. So, I don't have a bright side story there, but I do think thinking about what we can do and showing and demonstrating what is possible at the state and local level is part of what, not just like part of resisting the Trump administration, or kind of pulling up bulwarks to the destruction that's coming at us. But it's also the lesson of like remembering to look for the possibilities, not just the disaster, and try and work something forward instead of just what I do a little too much, which is look away because it is a hard time to be in. So look local, look to your state or your city, or try and build something up from what you got. I think it's a good discipline these days. I don't know.
I remember this is probably a totally inappropriate analogy and probably is not true history at all. But I remember, I think this was in high school. I learned, you learned about Greek civilization and Roman civilization, and then, the barbarians took over. This is all very crude. And, but then the idea was, but the knowledge was preserved in the monasteries, and then we had the Renaissance,
Irish monasteries, right.
And it all, this blooming of knowledge. So, we could, state and local governments through the dark ages of Donald Trump, they could preserve progressive
policy. The monasteries. Exactly. Be the monasteries.
Exactly. So let's hope for better, but we'll see. So thanks a lot for joining us, and I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Dean.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.